In this class, we are going to start the third kingdom out of the 5 kingdom classification, and that is the kingdom fungi. So, in our previous classes, we had completed the first 2 kingdoms, that is the Monera as well as the kingdom Protista. And here we are going to start the third kingdom, that is the fungi. So, this fungi kingdom is almost solely of those organisms which perform the role of a decomposer or sometimes parasitic. So these organisms are totally heterotrophic. These organisms do not have the ability to prepare its own food. So we have seen that almost in all the categories in our previous classes, that is in Protista, almost every category had some autotrophic as well as heterotrophic organisms. Likewise, in the Monera, every organism's simple categories do contain some autotrophic and also some heterotrophic categories. But in this case, none of the members are autotrophic. So this kingdom is solely of the heterotrophic organisms. And obviously, these are achlorophylous, that is, these organisms do not possess any sort of chlorophyll, so obviously they cannot perform photosynthesis. Apart from that, these also are non-vascular. So non-vascular means that these do not have a conducting system like xylem and phloem in the case of plants. So these organisms are very simple and sometimes unicellular and mostly multicellular. So these organisms have some unicellular forms like Saccharomyces or the yeast, and mostly these organisms are multicellular. Now the tissue formation is not very common in this case, but we will study something called as plectenchyma. So this is the normal characteristic of this kingdom, that is these are simple, non-vascular, these do not have a conducting system, these are achlorophylous, that is these organisms do not possess chlorophyll to perform photosynthesis, and also these are heterotrophic, that is these cannot prepare their own food and these have to either be dependent as a parasite or live as a saprophyte. So this is the 2 method of nutrition which is very common in this kingdom. Apart from that, these have spore bearing, and it is one of the most important feature of the kingdom fungi. So this spore bearing capability is one of the most important features over here. And obviously fungi are eukaryotes, because we know only the Monera are prokaryotes. Apart from the Monera, almost all the organisms, that is fungi or Protista, Plantae, Animalia, are eukaryotes. Now these have a distinct cell wall made up of chitin. So chitin is also called as fungal cellulose. So instead of chitin, we can say fungal cellulose. So when we will study about plants, and in plants when we will study about cell wall, we will see that the cell wall of plants is composed of cellulose. But here in this case, the cell wall is composed of the chitin. It is also a polysaccharide, but it has certain different structure as compared to the cellulose. And also this has a very important feature which is just like animal. We know that animals have glycogen as their reserve food and plants have starch as their reserved food. So these are not photosynthetic just like plants, and this is one characteristic which is similar to the animals. So animals like human beings or other mammals or reptiles or birds or fishes, these have glycogen as the reserve food, and these organisms also have glycogen as the reserve food. So this glycogen is a polysaccharide and it contains thousands of glucose molecules. So we can say that this glycogen is a polymer of glucose, so it is a polysaccharide, and in human beings this glycogen is normally stored in the muscle cells and also in liver cells. So this is the storage form of polysaccharide or a carbohydrate. So these features were the most common features that is present in the kingdom fungi. Now we come to the second point. These are cosmopolitan, that is these are found almost everywhere, but there are 2 types of locations where these organisms prefer, and one is moist and also a bit warm. So warm and moist, these are the 2 favorite sites where this fungi can reside. So warm and moist conditions are the most favorable conditions for the growth of a fungus or any fungus for its growth. It requires or it favors a moist as well as a very warm environment. So these are cosmopolitan and mostly occur in moist and humus rich soil. So we know what is humus. You must have studied about humus in your lower classes, where you must have studied that these humus is formed by the dead remains of plants and animals and various other categories. So these fungi decompose that humus, and obviously that is why these are normally found in moist soil, because in dry soil fungi cannot perform decomposition as quickly as in moist soil. So it is very much abundant in humus rich soil, which is rich in moisture also. So this is a very common location for fungi if provided proper moisture. Now there are some dry things also, for example wood or leather or paper. So these are relatively drier things, but if we provide enough moisture to these things, then fungi can also decompose these things. So fungi can also live on these places if we provide or enough ample or moisture is provided over there. So if enough moisture is provided, these fungi can also grow on wood, leather, bread, etc. So there are various other food substrate where these can grow, but not in a dry form. So these fungi cannot grow on very well on wood or leather or paper or here bread if they are very dry. But once they become moist, these fungi can easily grow over those places. Now if we come to the nutrition, how these fungi obtain their nutrition, and the most common one is this saprophyte. Fungi and bacteria are the two most important decomposers on the planet. So this saprophyte is its decomposer form. So this saprophytic fungi is one of the most important decomposers organisms on the planet. So these saprophytic means that these normally are found on dead and decaying plant matter. For example, they are decaying leaves or stems or roots or any such parts, or decaying fruits or any such vegetables. So these decompose those organisms because that is their main role, and that is why these are being called as saprophytic. Now these fungi obtain their nourishment from dead organic matter such as bread, rotting vegetable, fruits, dung, etc. So obviously this is where saprophytes are formed, where the organic remains of various dead organisms are occurring. So this is also a saprophytic category, just like many other saprophytic bacteria also. And the other one is the fungi which lives on living host or alive host, and parasitic, that obviously means that it harms that living host. So these parasitic fungi could also cause us various diseases, and in humans also there are certain diseases which is called as athlete's foot or tinea or ringworm. So these are some of the fungal diseases which are caused by fungi in humans. So those fungi are the parasitic fungi. So these obtain nourishment from living host, and these have a special structure which is used for absorption of nutrient from the host, and that is called as hostorium. So this hostoria is the plural of hostorium. So these are the absorptive structure. These are the structures through which fungi can obtain its nourishment from the host. Now we come to another type of nutrition, and that is symbiotic. So symbiotic means a mutual association where both the organisms are benefited from each other. So there are two very important and very common forms of fungal association with other organisms. For example, in the case of lichens, fungi is associated with alga. So in this case, the fungi provides protection to the alga, and also the fungi helps in absorption of minerals and water from the substrate or the medium. So this fungi is providing protection to the alga, and also it is absorbing nutrition from the substrate. And what is the function of alga? We know that alga is photosynthetic or autotrophic. So alga prepares food. So fungi does not need prepared food because the food is being prepared by the alga through photosynthesis. So alga is providing food to the fungi is providing protection, minerals and water to the alga. So this is a very mutually beneficial association, and that association or that intimate connection between these organisms is named a structure which is called as lichens. Now there is one another association, and that is with the roots of higher plants, and those are called as mycorrhiza. So these mycorrhiza are association of fungi plus roots of higher plants. For example, higher plants, gymnosperms and angiosperms. So fungi are normally associated with the roots of gymnosperms, and especially there is a genus which is called as glomus. So those genus, that is the genus of the fungi, are very commonly found in the roots of the higher plants, or associated with the roots of the higher plants. So this was the 2 or 3 types of nutrition in fungi, that is saprophytic, parasitic and also the symbiotic. Now fungi are not very evolved or very complex organisms. These are relatively simpler organisms, and therefore if we see the tissue, then its tissues are not very much evolved, just like animals or other plants. For example, gymnosperms or angiosperms have a very higher evolved tissue system, but these organisms don't have very well developed tissue. So the tissue of fungi is normally called as plectenchyma. So the simple feature of a plectenchyma is interweaving of fungal hyphae. So we will later study that the body of a fungi is normally composed of mycelium, and one thread of mycelium is called as hypha. So many hypha are interwoven together, and that sort of a tissue, sort of a structure which is getting formed, that is called as this plectenchyma. Now there are 2 types of plectenchyma, or we can say 2 forms of plectenchyma. The first one is this prosenchyma, and the other one is the pseudoparenchyma. So this prosenchyma, it has distinct hypha just like this. So it has distinct hypha running together in parallel and interwoven form. So we can say that it has something like this. So these fungi have certain hypha which are parallel to each other but also interwoven. For example, like this, these are interwoven with each other, and also some are parallel to each other. So we can see that most of the hypha are parallel to each other, so running together in parallel and interwoven. So we can see that some are interwoven, that is, these are forming something like this structure, and this form is called as prosenchyma. Now here is one point very important. The individual cells are elongated. We can say that individual cells are elongated, these are long, but these are individual cells. We can easily differentiate between the cells over here. This is one cell, then one cell, then one cell. So this form is called as the prosenchyma. Now we have another type of tissue, and that is the pseudoparenchyma. So here there is compaction of hyphal cells. A lot of hyphal cells are compacted together. So it is formed by close packing and fusion of hypha. So these are so closely fused or so compactly arranged that it results in the fusion of hypha, and therefore the individual cells are not distinguishable. For example, if we see here, we can easily distinguish one cell from the other, but in this case we cannot distinguish one cell from the other cell, because these are so compactly and so closely arranged at one place. So these are the 2 forms of the plectenchyma, that is the tissue of the fungi. Now we come to the homothallic and heterothallic. So homothallic means that there is a fungi which has self-reproductive capability over its body, or because of certain structures of its body. So in these, every thallus is sexually self-fertile, that is, it is reproductively able to perform reproduction on its own. It does not need any assistance of another thallus. So the fungi are normally thalloid, that is, these are not very advanced organisms or complex organisms. So these have simple thallus-like body organization. So the homothallic fungi means that every thallus is sexually self-fertile or sexually independent. It can perform reproduction on its own. It doesn't need any other thallus. So this is important over here. Sexually self-fertile. So the homothallic fungi does not need any other, that is, therefore can perform reproduction without the help of another thallus. It does not need another thallus to help in reproduction. And a very common example is the albugo. We will later study that there are various forms or species of albugo like albugo candida, so that causes diseases also. And now we have heterothallic. So these are sexually self-sterile. These cannot perform reproduction on their own. They need some other thallus which should be genetically different but of the similar type. So in these, every thallus is sexually self-sterile. So compare with above, sexually self-fertile and sexually self-sterile, that it is opposite of the sexually self-fertile category. So these organisms are sexually self-sterile. So these cannot perform reproduction on their own. Therefore, they need another compatible. Compatible means it should be of the same species and certain genetic features should be there. Now, of a different mating type, the mating type, that is, we can say the genotype or something called genetic features should be different, and therefore to complete sexual reproduction it requires another thallus of a compatible mating type and also of a different mating type. So this is the difference between the homothallic and heterothallic fungi. So it does not need any other thallus for a reproduction. It needs another thallus which should be sexually which should be compatible thallus. Apart from it should be of a different mating type. So there are most of the fungi which are of this type. So only a few fungi like the albugo are homothallic. The majority of the fungi, for example, these are the most common fungi, that is Mucor, Puccinia, Rhizopus. So apart from these three, most of the fungi fall into this category of heterothallic. So homothallic is in minority, heterothallic is in majority. So these are a few, some of the most important features that we have to study while studying the intro of the kingdom fungi. Now we have to understand what is hypha and mycelium.